She grabbed the wine bottle with both hands in front of 400 people and poured it straight down onto a man who never raised his voice, never raised his fists, and never said a single word to deserve it. The room went dead silent, and the man she just humiliated. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he didn't even flinch. He just reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, made one call, and quietly ended a $2 billion deal that her families had spent 3 years chasing. But here's what nobody in that ballroom understood yet. This night was never about the money. Drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. You do not want to miss where this one goes. The bottle was already in her hand before anyone had time to react. That was the thing Ethan Walker would remember years later, not the cold splash of the wine hitting his chest, not the gasps rolling through the ballroom like a wave, not even the burning humiliation of standing there, soaked in front of 400 of the most powerful people in the country. What he remembered was the speed of it, how fast cruelty could happen when a person decided that someone else simply didn't matter. 1 second he was standing there holding a glass of water, speaking quietly to one of the event staff, a young woman who had nearly dropped an entire tray of champagne flutes and was visibly fighting back tears. And the next second, the CEO of Harrington Global was standing 2 feet in front of him with a Chateau Margaux 2009 vintage, tilted at 45 degrees over his shoulder. The wine hit the back of his collar first, then it spread, cold and red and deliberate across the shoulders of his suit jacket, soaking through the white dress shirt beneath, running down his spine. The room, the kind of room where deals were made over handshakes and everything had a price, went completely, totally silent. Not the polite silence of people pretending not to notice something uncomfortable. The real silence. The silence of 400 people holding their breath because they had just watched something they couldn't believe actually happened, and they were still deciding whether to trust their own eyes. Victoria Harrington set the bottle back on the table beside her, like she had just finished a toast. She smoothed the front of her gown, a midnight blue Valentino, custom-fitted, the kind of dress that cost more than most people's cars, and she looked at the man standing in front of her, and she smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a cold one, the kind of smile that says, "I have never once believed you deserved to be in this room, and now everyone in this room knows it too." "There," she said. "Now you look like you belong somewhere else." Ethan Walker did not move. He had learned a long time ago in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in conversations with people who thought position meant power, that the most devastating response to arrogance was stillness. Not weakness, not submission, stillness. The kind that made the other person keep talking while you were already 3 steps ahead. So he stood there, wine running down the back of his neck, soaking through the collar of a suit that, if anyone in that room had looked carefully, was actually cut by one of the finest tailors on the East Coast. Nothing flashy, nothing labeled, just extraordinarily good fabric that most people in that ballroom wouldn't have recognized because they spent their lives chasing logos instead of quality. He let the silence breathe. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, the inside one, the left side, and pulled out a cloth handkerchief. The old-fashioned kind, white cotton, ironed. A habit he'd carried since his father first handed him one when he was 12 years old and told him, "A man who always has a handkerchief always has his composure." He pressed it against the back of his neck. He looked at Victoria Harrington, and he said quietly, clearly, without a single tremor in his voice, "Thank you for making this easy." Victoria blinked. It wasn't the response she expected. She had expected rage. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected the defensive stammering of a man who knew he was out of place and was finally being shown the door. She had not expected gratitude. "Excuse me," she said. Ethan was already reaching for his phone. The call lasted 11 seconds. Ethan Walker spoke 4 sentences to the person who answered, and then he ended the call and returned the phone to his jacket pocket and stood quietly, while around him the Grand Sterling Hotel ballroom continued to breathe and sparkle and hum with the machinery of a celebration that had no idea yet how thoroughly it had just been dismantled. The 4 sentences were, "It's Ethan. I've seen everything I needed to see tonight. Freeze the Harrington position across all accounts. All of it, and then yes, all $2 billion. He pressed his handkerchief one more time against his collar, folded it, returned it to his pocket. Then he turned to the young woman, who had nearly dropped the tray. She was still standing there, wide-eyed, like someone who had just witnessed a car accident on a street They walked every single day, and he said to her, with complete gentleness, "You're doing a great job tonight. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She stared at him. "Sir, who are you?" It was a tired smile. Not unhappy, just the kind of smile that lives behind a long history. "Nobody important," he said. "You have a good evening." And he walked out of the Grand Sterling Hotel ballroom without looking back. Victoria Harrington watched him go. Something in her chest moved in a direction she didn't like. She turned to her assistant, a sharp, efficient woman named Claire, who had worked for the Harrington family for 9 years and had survived longer than anyone else in that position, specifically because she knew when to speak and when to stay silent. Tonight, Claire's expression was doing something Victoria had never quite seen it do before. "What?" Victoria said. "Nothing, Ms. Harrington, Claire." Claire looked at her tablet. Then she looked up. "I'm sure it's nothing." The ceremony was 3 minutes from starting. Victoria had a speech to give, a historic partnership to announce, the kind of night that would cement her legacy as not just her father's daughter but her own force, a CEO, who had pulled off the single largest private investment in Harrington Global's 90-year history. She straightened her spine, turned toward the stage, and tried to ignore the fact that the man she had just soaked in wine had not seemed embarrassed. He had seemed finished. Let's go back 6 hours. Because the story of what happened in that ballroom doesn't begin with the wine. It begins with a Tuesday morning in October, in a house in Westchester County that looked, from the outside, like the home of a comfortable but not extravagant upper-middle-class family. 3 bedrooms, a good-sized yard with a swing set that had been there since the previous owners, but that the current owner had never taken down because his daughter had claimed it on the first day and declared it perfect. The kitchen smelled like coffee and slightly burnt toast. Ethan Walker stood at the stove in a navy blue Henley and gray sweatpants, with a spatula in one hand and his phone in the other, reading an email from his chief financial officer while simultaneously monitoring 4 strips of bacon that were approaching the exact moment between done and overdone, a moment he'd learned to identify through long practice because his daughter was 9 years old and she had precise opinions about bacon. "Dad," he flipped the bacon, "it's not ready yet." "I know it's not ready. That's not what I was going to say." He looked up. Lily Walker stood in the kitchen doorway in her school uniform, the dark blue plaid of Westchester Academy, white collar perfectly pressed, backpack already on her shoulders. Dark hair pulled into 2 braids that were slightly asymmetrical because Ethan had done them himself, and he had been doing them for 4 years now. And they were still slightly asymmetrical every single time, and they had both stopped noticing. She held up a sheet of paper. "There's a thing tonight," she said. "A thing, at school, the Fall Parent Showcase, where parents come and see what we've been working on." Ethan set down the spatula, looked at the paper, read the date. He felt the familiar slow pressure behind his sternum, the one that arrived every time he had to calculate which obligation he could bend and which one he couldn't. Tonight was the Harrington Gala. He had been preparing for the Harrington Gala for 3 months. The due diligence, the analyst reports, the conversations with his board about the risks and the potential and the strategic alignment. $2 billion was not even for Ethan Walker a number you moved carelessly. It required every piece of information he could gather. He had chosen to attend the gala precisely because the last piece of information couldn't be found in a spreadsheet. And now his daughter was standing in his kitchen in her school uniform holding a paper. "The Fall Parent Showcase," he repeated. "It's in the afternoon," Lily said, carefully, not making it sound like an ultimatum. She had learned this from him, how to present a fact without turning it into a demand. She was 9 years old, and she was already better at it than most adults he knew. 4 o'clock, you'd be done by 6, he looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said, "You miss things sometimes, and it costs us both." Because they didn't say that kind of thing. They had come to an understanding, the 2 of them, in the 3 years since her mother died, that they would be honest with each other without being cruel to each other, and that they would show up for each other with everything they had, and that some days everything you had still wasn't quite enough, and that was okay too. "I'll be there," he said, 4 o'clock. She nodded, came to the table, sat down. "Is the bacon ready?" "Almost. You always say almost because it's almost always almost." She almost smiled. Almost. He was there at 4 o'clock. He sat in a small plastic chair in a classroom that smelled like art supplies and hand sanitizer, and he watched his daughter stand at the front of the room and present a project she had been working on for 6 weeks about ocean conservation. And she looked at him exactly once, right at the beginning, to check that he was there. And when she saw him, she stood a little straighter. And then she didn't look at him again, because she was 9 years old, and 9-year-olds did not want their parents to watch them too closely. He stayed for the entire showcase. He spoke to her teachers. He ate the cookies the parents were supposed to bring, and had forgotten to bring, and that the PTA had covered for the 3rd time this year, which was a kindness he had started quietly underwriting by donating to the PTA fund anonymously because he felt responsible for the gap, even on the nights he managed to fill it. He drove Lily home. He made dinner. He helped her with the math homework she'd been putting off. At 8:15 she went to bed. At 8:20 he put on the suit. He had debated the suit for longer than he usually admitted to anyone. Not because he cared about fashion. Ethan Walker genuinely did not care about fashion in any way that could be measured. He owned 7 suits, all of them excellent, none of them obvious, and he wore whichever one his housekeeper had laid out without giving it much thought. He had debated the suit because he was making a decision about the night. He could arrive at the Harrington Gala as what he was the founder and principal of Walker Capital Group, with the identification that entitled, with the security detail that accompanied, with the advance team that cleared rooms. He could walk in through the VIP entrance and take his seat at the table nearest the stage, and everyone in that room would have known exactly who he was within 30 seconds. Or he could arrive as himself, just Ethan Walker, 41 years old. Single father. Glass of water. He chose himself because the investment he was considering wasn't really about Harrington Global's balance sheets. He had people who understood balance sheets. He had 3 floors of analysts whose entire job was to understand balance sheets. What he needed to understand was something different. He needed to understand the character of the place. The way the company's leadership behaved when they thought the room was full of people who either served them or needed something from them. The way power worked in this organization when the cameras were recording the speeches but not the hallways. The way the people at the top of Harrington Global treated the people at the bottom. Because in Ethan Walker's experience, and this experience ran deep, ran back to a childhood, watching his father come home from 12-hour shifts at a manufacturing plant and still find energy to coach Little League. On Saturday mornings, the way a company treated its workers told you everything you needed to know about whether that company deserved to grow. He straightened his collar in the mirror. Behind him, the house was quiet. Lily was asleep. His housekeeper, Mrs. Callahan, was in the small apartment above the garage in case Lily needed anything. He thought briefly about Margaret. He still did that. Thought about his wife in mirrors. She had had strong opinions about what he wore, and he still heard her voice sometimes in front of reflective surfaces. That tie doesn't go with that shirt, Ethan. Honestly. And the ache that came with it was not sharp anymore. It was something else. Something that had settled into him like weather. He picked up his car keys. He drove himself. The Grand Sterling Hotel was exactly the kind of place designed to make certain people feel like they belonged, and other people feel like they didn't. Ethan had been in rooms like this his entire adult life, and had spent most of that time resistant to the thing they were doing to him, the architectural manipulation, the cultivated grandeur, the sensory instruction to feel small or feel chosen depending on which side of the guest list you were on. He handed his invitation to the man at the door, a young man with a professional smile who looked at the card, looked at Ethan, looked at the card again, and was waved through without incident. Inside, the gala was already in full acceleration. 400 people in formal wear, champagne moving through the room on silver trays. The kind of appetizers that were very small and very expensive, and were eaten in one bite so nobody ever felt full. Music from a string quartet in the corner, playing things that sounded important. A stage at the far end with a podium and a backdrop that read Harrington Global, the next century in silver letters on navy. Ethan took a glass of water from a passing tray. He moved through the room slowly. He was not looking at the stage. He was not looking at the executives working the crowd with their handshakes and their deliberate laughter. He was not looking at the investment bankers, comparing portfolios, or the lawyers tracking angles, or the journalist buildings, the quotes they'd already half-written before they arrived. He was watching the edges, the staff, the event workers carrying trays, refilling glasses, clearing plates, adjusting microphone stands, repositioning centerpieces that kept getting knocked slightly out of alignment by guests who never noticed. He watched how those workers were treated, A woman in a catering uniform dropped a cocktail napkin near a cluster of executives. She bent to pick it up, and one of the men, gray suit, significant watch, the practiced casual authority of a man who had been powerful long enough to stop noticing it, stepped backward onto her hand. She winced. He didn't notice. She retrieved the napkin and moved on. The man said something to the person beside him, and they both laughed. Ethan noted this. He moved to another part of the room. Near the bar, a junior waitstaff member couldn't have been more than 22. The barely concealed terror of someone on their first high-profile event had poured a drink slightly over the requested level, and the guest receiving it had responded with a 15-second lecture on professional standards that left the young man's face scarlet and his hands slightly unsteady as he poured the correction. The guest turned back to his conversation without another word. Ethan noted this too. He found a quiet spot near one of the room's support columns and stood there for a while, watching. This was how he had always worked. Before he built anything, before he invested in anything, he watched how people moved, how they spoke to each other, where the kindness actually lived in an organization, not in the press releases, not in the corporate values printed on laminated cards in break rooms, but in the small, unrehearsed moments when people thought nobody powerful was paying attention. He had been standing there for perhaps 20 minutes when he heard a sound nearby, the specific sound of something going badly wrong with a tray of glasses. Her name, he would learn later, was Sophia Bennett. She was 28 years old, had a master's degree in hospitality management from Cornell, and was running her first major corporate event as senior event coordinator for the Sterling's events team. She was also, in this particular moment, watching in controlled horror as one of her junior staff, a 19-year-old named Marcus, who had been working events for 3 months, had managed to bump a service cart that had in turn destabilized a tray of 12 champagne flutes that were now in the process of deciding between standing and falling. Sophia moved before Marcus did. She caught the tray with both hands. Not cleanly, not elegantly. One glass fell anyway, hit the floor, shattered, and she absorbed the impact of the others, with a sharp bend of her knees that got champagne on her jacket sleeve and probably on her blouse beneath it. She set the tray down, looked at Marcus. His face was the color of chalk. "Hey," she said quietly enough that only he could hear. "You're okay. Take a breath." "I'm so sorry, Ms. Bennett. Marcus. Her voice was steady, calm. The kind of calm that wasn't performed but was actually functional. The calm of someone who had decided panic was a luxury and had simply stopped purchasing it. "Grab the dustpan from the service station. I'll handle the guests." "You're fine. I could have if that had..." It didn't. "You're fine." She squeezed his arm briefly. "Go." He went. She turned to the 2 guests nearest the breakage, both of whom were looking at her with the particular expression of people deciding whether to be annoyed, and she smiled at them with genuine warmth. Not the professional veneer variety, and said, "My apologies. Fresh drinks coming right to you. Can I bring you something different? Or keep you with the Moet?" They kept the Moet. She arranged it. She ensured the floor was safely cleared. She checked in with Marcus twice more over the next 10 minutes to make sure he hadn't decided to walk off the event floor, which he hadn't, because something in the way she'd spoken to him had apparently convinced him that disasters could be survived. Ethan had watched all of it, and when the tray situation was resolved and Sophia straightened up and found a quiet moment to take a breath, she found the quiet man near the support column, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Not attraction, not appraisal. Something more like recognition. "You handled that well," he said. She blinked. "Just doing the job." "No," he said. "Doing the job is catching the tray. What you did after was different." She looked at him. Took him in the modest dark suit, the glass of water, the complete absence of the category signals she'd spent years learning to read at events like this. He wasn't wearing a name tag because this was the kind of event where name tags weren't required. People were supposed to know each other. He didn't have a security detail nearby. He didn't have the particular territorial posture of the people in this room who were used to having space made for them. He looked, to put it plainly, like someone who had perhaps wandered into the wrong event. And yet he didn't feel that way. "Are you a guest?" she asked. "I want to make sure you have everything you need." "I have everything I need," he said. "Thank you." She nodded. Started to move away. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophia Bennett, Senior Coordinator, Sophia." He offered his hand. "Ethan Walker." She shook it. "Enjoy the evening, Mr. Walker." She moved back into the flow of the event. He watched her go. Then he went back to watching the room. That was when Victoria Harrington saw him. She was moving through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been raised to work a room her father's parties, her grandfather's galas. 30 years of events where the point was to be seen by the right people, and to see them back, and to maintain the elaborate social architecture that kept power organized. She was, by any objective measure, impressive. Harrington Global was a 90-year-old conglomerate manufacturing, real estate, a growing technology division that had been run by Harrington men for 3 generations, until Victoria had taken the CEO position 4 years ago, and spent those 4 years proving, through a combination of genuine intelligence and iron will, that the company was better in her hands than it had been in her father's. She had also spent those 4 years maintaining the belief, conscious or otherwise, that there was a correct order to things, that position and appearance were information, that a person who looked like they belonged in a room usually did, and a person who didn't usually had no business being there. She crossed the ballroom. She saw the quiet man near the support column. He was talking to one of her event staff, the young coordinator, Sophia something, and there was something in the ease of his posture, the complete absence of performance in it, that irritated her in a way she couldn't immediately name. She watched him for a moment. He wasn't working the room. He wasn't trying to be seen. He wasn't holding the right drink or standing near the right people. He looked, she decided, like exactly the kind of person who got into these events by knowing someone who knew someone, and then spent the entire night trying to make the most of it. Her chief of security appeared at her elbow. "That man," she said. "The one near the column. Is he on the guest list?" The security chief checked his tablet. "Yes, Ms. Harrington." He checked in at the door. "Is he media?" "No record of that." "A vendor?" "Not listed as one." "Then who brought him?" "His name appears on the primary invitation list, ma'am." "Independent entry." She looked at the man again. He was still talking easily, unhurried, to her event coordinator. "Someone made a mistake," she said. "Make sure he stays out of the VIP section." "Yes, Miss Harrington." She moved on. She had a room to work. The first time they spoke was 40 minutes before the ceremony. Ethan had been watching a quiet exchange near the catering station, a senior Harrington executive dressing down a waiter over a plate of hors d'oeuvre that had been served in the wrong order, and he had just noted the executive's name from the name badge because the executive's behavior was data, and the investment decision required all available data when he felt someone stop beside him. He looked over. Victoria Harrington was taller than he'd expected. She held herself with the particular physics of someone who had been told from childhood that rooms were hers. She looked at him. "Excuse me, yes? Are you lost?" The question landed where she intended it to land, as an assessment, not an offer of help. The word lost doing the specific work of a word chosen to diminish. Ethan looked at her calmly. "No, I was invited," she smiled. "I'm sure." A couple of nearby guests had noticed. The exchange had drifted slightly closer with the social instinct of people who sense a scene forming. "People often misplace their invitations," Victoria said. "It happens. I didn't misplace mine," Ethan said. "I used it at the door. I imagine that's how invitations work." Someone nearby made a quiet sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a cough. Victoria's smile stayed perfectly in place, though something behind it sharpened. "The VIP section requires a separate credential. I want to make sure you understand that for your comfort." "I wasn't in the VIP section," Ethan said. "I was standing here." "Right." She looked him over once, slowly, the survey of a person who has developed habitual confidence in their own read of a situation. "Well, enjoy the event." She moved away. Ethan watched her go. He took a sip of his water, made a note. The second conversation happened at the ceremony. The signing was scheduled for 9 o'clock. At 8:45, the room began repositioning toward the stage, the slow gravitational pull of a crowd toward the main event. Ethan had moved to the right side of the room, near the stage steps, where he had a clear line of sight to the signing table and to the podium, more usefully, to the reactions of the people around it. He wanted to see faces. He wanted to see who looked genuinely proud, and who looked relieved, and who looked calculating, and who looked afraid. He had been watching faces in rooms like this for 20 years, and he had learned to trust what he saw. Victoria was climbing the stage steps when she noticed him standing there. She stopped. The expression that crossed her face was not subtle. She came back down. "You're still here." Ethan looked at her steadily. "Yes, you seem very comfortable for someone who... For someone who what?" The question was clean, no hostility, no defensiveness. Just a straight, clear question that required her to finish the sentence she'd started and accept the meaning of whatever she chose as her ending. She didn't finish it. She pivoted. "This is the VIP stage area," she said. "It's restricted." "I'm not on the stage," Ethan said. "I'm standing 4 feet from the stage. I'd prefer if you moved back. I'd prefer to stay where I am." The quiet firmness of it seemed to genuinely surprise her. She was used to authority working on contact, a word, a look, the sheer gravitational force of her position, pulling people into compliance. This man appeared to be, for reasons she couldn't locate, immune. And she did not understand immunity, which meant she responded to it the only way she knew how to respond to things she didn't understand. With more force, she reached out to a passing server and took the wine bottle from the tray. Several people nearby noticed. Sophia, who had been managing the stage area transitions, looked up. The room, without anyone announcing it, began to quiet. "People like you," Victoria said, the sentence starting somewhere that had been building for an hour. Since the first time she'd seen him near that column, talking to her event coordinator, like he, off the space think that just being in the room is the same as belonging in the room. Ethan said nothing. Maybe this will clarify things. She poured the wine, the sound of it, of the gasps, of the sudden silence, of the crystal clarity of what had just happened, settled over the ballroom, like something dropped from a great height. Sophia moved first. She was through the crowd in 4 steps, and when she reached Ethan, she was already pulling a linen cloth from her event kit, her voice low and urgent and genuinely horrified. "Mr. Walker, I am so sorry. I can't, please let me." Ethan turned to her. He looked at her directly. His voice was completely, impossibly level. "Sophia," she stopped. "You have nothing to apologize for. This is not on you, but what you should have done, you did. You treated every person in this room tonight the way people deserve to be treated." He held her gaze. "That's enough. That's more than enough." She stood there, holding the linen cloth with both hands. And she would admit this later, though she was not someone who admitted things easily, very close to crying. Not because of the wine, because of the way he said it. He turned back to the room. Victoria Harrington was watching him with the uncertainty of someone who had fired what they believed was their decisive shot and found the target still standing. "Are you finished?" Ethan asked her. She opened her mouth. He reached into his jacket pocket. He dialed. The call lasted 11 seconds. He ended it, returned the phone to his pocket, looked at Victoria. "Thank you," he said, "for making the decision very easy." And then he walked across the ballroom, the crowd parting without him asking it to. People stepping back the way they do when something in the air changes, and they feel it before they understand it. And he went through the doors of the Grand Sterling Hotel and into the night. He did not look back. Behind him, Victoria Harrington stood at the foot of the stage steps in her midnight blue Valentino gown. The signing table was set. The contracts were ready. The room was watching her. And 45 feet away, at the event manager's station against the far wall, Claire was staring at her tablet, with an expression that could only be described as a person, watching something very large begin to collapse from a very great distance. Victoria straightened her spine. She climbed the stage steps. She reached the podium. She adjusted the microphone. And in 5 minutes, her father would find her there, with a phone in his hand, and a face she had never seen on him before, a face that contained, in equal measure, fury and fear. And he would say 4 words to her that she would hear for the rest of her life. Do you know who? But that is the next part of this story. Right now, Ethan Walker was in the parking lot of the Grand Sterling Hotel, sitting in the driver's seat of his car, wine still damp against his collar, holding his phone in both hands. He wasn't calling his lawyers. He wasn't calling his board. He wasn't calling anyone. He was calling his daughter. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did, in the flat, sleepy voice of a 9-year-old who had been asleep for 2 hours and was operating on the automatic pilot of a kid who knew when the late-night call from Dad meant everything is fine, I just needed to hear your voice. Dad, hey Lilybug, it's late, I know, I'm sorry. Go back to sleep. A pause, the small sound of her settling. Are you okay? He looked out the windshield at the lights of the Grand Sterling. Yeah, he said, yeah, I'm okay. She was already half asleep again. You smell like you always smell when you come home from those things. What do I smell like? Disappointed, she said, in people. He was quiet for a moment. Get some sleep, he said. Night, Dad. Good night, Lily. He sat in the car for a while longer. Then he drove home. The $2 billion deal was frozen at 9:07 p.m. By 9:15 p.m., the lawyers had confirmed receipt of the freeze instructions. By 9:22 p.m., the first bank representative had left the building. By 9:31 p.m., the signing table was empty, and Victoria Harrington was still on stage. Still at the podium, still holding the microphone, still waiting for someone to tell her it wasn't real. The clock on the wall of Walker Capital Group's executive floor read 9:47 p.m. when Daniel Reeves picked up the phone. Daniel had been Ethan's chief legal officer for 11 years. He was the kind of lawyer who did not panic, not because he was incapable of it, but because he had made a professional decision early in his career that panic was a form of incompetence he couldn't afford. He had survived hostile takeovers, regulatory investigations, 3 separate occasions where the SEC had requested documents, and one memorably terrible Tuesday in 2019 when 4 separate deals had collapsed simultaneously before noon. He had never received a freeze instruction on a $2 billion position at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. He read the confirmation message from Ethan's assistant twice. Then he called Marcus Webb, the head of their investment operations division. "Did you get the Harrington freeze?" he asked. Marcus had gotten it. Ethan called it himself. "Direct line. I've never had him call me directly." "How locked is it?" "Completely. Nothing moves without his personal authorization. I've already notified the banks. They're pulling their representatives from the Sterling." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Do we know what happened?" "No. Get me everything on Victoria Harrington you can find before morning. Background, public record, anything the compliance team flagged and didn't escalate." He paused. "And Marcus, don't call Ethan tonight. Whatever happened, he'll talk when he's ready." The call ended. Daniel sat in the dark of his office. He hadn't bothered to turn the overhead lights on when he'd come back in, and the glow of his monitors was the only light in the room. And he thought about the fact that in 11 years, Ethan Walker had never once made a decision of this size in 11 seconds. Something significant had happened. He didn't know yet what it was. He was about to find out, along with every other person in the country who watched morning television. At 9:52 p.m., the first video hit social media. Someone in the Grand Sterling Ballroom, and they would never be definitively identified. Though the working theory among Harrington's communications team was that it was a junior journalist who had been covering the event for a business trade publication, had captured the entire exchange on their phone. 47 seconds of footage. The approach, the conversation, the wine bottle, the pour, the silence, and then the brief, extraordinary moment when Ethan looked at Victoria Harrington and said, with complete calm, "Thank you for making the decision very easy." The clip was posted without comment. It did not need comment. By 10:15, it had 200,000 views. By 11, it had cleared 1 million. By midnight, Victoria Harrington's name was trending in 9 states. By 2 in the morning, every major financial news network had picked up the story. Not the social media story, not yet, but the business story, the one that arrived when reporters started making calls, and discovered that the Harrington Global signing ceremony had ended without a signing, that the bank representatives had departed early, that the $2 billion investment that was supposed to cement the company's financial future had, according to 3 separate sources with direct knowledge of the situation, been frozen. By 3 a.m., 2 words were appearing in headlines across every financial publication in the country. Walker Capital, the name that had been absent from the room all evening, the name that nobody at the gala had connected to the quiet man in the modest dark suit, was suddenly, irreversibly, everywhere. And in a bedroom in Westchester County, a 9-year-old girl slept through all of it. Her father sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, and read the headlines as they came in. He did not look like a man who had just moved $2 billion. He looked like a man thinking about something his wife had said to him 11 years ago, at the beginning of everything. She had said, "The way you're building this, Ethan, the way you're going to be when it's big, promise me you'll remember what your father taught you." He had asked what she meant. "He taught you that the people who work hardest are usually the ones nobody sees. Promise me you'll always see them," he had promised. He still kept it. He poured the cold coffee into the sink. He went to bed. Tomorrow was going to require everything he had. He was right about that. At 7:15 the next morning, his phone rang 14 times before 8 o'clock. He answered 2 of them, Daniel, and his daughter's school, confirming a field trip permission slip he'd forgotten to submit, which he did online while Daniel talked and felt no guilt about the multitasking because Daniel was used to it. At 8:30, he drove Lily to school. He walked her to the front door, the way he always did. She was quiet for most of the drive, which usually meant she was thinking, and she proved it at the school entrance when she stopped and looked up at him. "It was bad last night," she said. "It was not a question. It was something. Is the deal done?" He looked at her. She was 9. She had grown up in the periphery of his world, and she understood more of it than most people would have been comfortable with. He had decided early on that honest abbreviated was better than comfortable fiction. "The deal is on hold," he said. She considered this with the gravity of a child who knows the weight of careful language. "Is it on hold because of something they did or something you did?" "Something they did." She nodded. "Okay." She picked up her backpack strap. "Are you going to fix it?" "I'm going to deal with it." "Those are different things." He almost smiled. He almost said, "I know. That's exactly why I used the second one." Instead, he crouched down to her level, which he did sometimes not to minimize her or treat her younger than she was, but because he wanted her to understand that there was no version of any day in which she was not the first thing that mattered. "Go learn something," he said. "I'll be here at 3. You have things. I have things. I'll be here at 3. She held his gaze for a moment, checking the way she always checked, the quiet inventory of a child who had lost one parent and had developed, in the years since, a very precise radar for whether the remaining one was okay, and then she seemed satisfied with what she found. "Okay," she said. She went inside. He stood there for a moment after the door closed. Then his phone rang again. It was James Harrington, the company founder, Victoria's father. 81 years old, built the company from a regional manufacturing firm into a national conglomerate over 50 years, and one of the 12 people in the country whose call Ethan would always take, not because of the money or the history, but because James Harrington had been a friend of Ethan's father. He answered. "James, Ethan." The voice on the other end was 81 years old, and it sounded at this morning the particular weight of a man who had lived long enough to know when something he built was in genuine danger. "I owe you more than an apology. I know that. You don't owe me anything. My daughter." "Is your daughter?"
Ethan said.
"And that's something only you can understand better than anyone. But James, what happened last night isn't something I can move past by accepting an apology." Silence on the line. "I know," James said finally. "I know that, Ethan. That's why I'm calling, not to fix it with words. I want to ask if you'll come in today. Not for the deal. I want to sit across a table from you and have an honest conversation. The kind we used to have." Ethan was quiet. He was standing in the school parking lot. 2 other parents were loading children into an SUV 20 feet away, laughing about something. "A perfectly ordinary Friday morning. Not today," Ethan said. "Give me until Monday." Monday, James's voice was careful. "All right, and James, the conversation on Monday isn't going to be about the $2 billion. A pause. "What's it going to be about?" "It's going to be about whether Harrington Global deserves to keep growing." The call ended. Ethan stood in the parking lot for another 30 seconds. Then he got in his car and went to work. The Walker Capital offices occupied 3 floors of a building in Midtown Manhattan that had been chosen specifically because it looked like exactly what it was, a serious place, where serious work happened and not at all like the aggressive, architectural self-promotion that characterized most firms of its size and reach. No logo on the exterior, no lobby art selected by a committee to project power. Just clean lines, natural light, and 800 employees who had been hired because they were exceptionally good at something and had been retained because the firm treated them like it. When Ethan arrived at 9:15, Daniel was already in the conference room with 3 analysts and a communications director and a printout of every piece of publicly available information on Harrington Global's corporate governance structure. He walked in, set down his coffee. "Show me what you have." What they had was considerable. The compliance team had flagged concerns about Harrington Global's internal culture 18 months ago, during the initial due diligence phase, and the flag had been categorized as yellow noteworthy but not disqualifying. There were 2 wrongful termination settlements from the previous 4 years, both under NDA, both involving employees who had reportedly raised concerns about management conduct. There was a pattern in the employee survey data, which Harrington Global published, as required by their governance framework, in a summarized form of declining scores in the categories of management respect and workplace dignity over the same period that Victoria Harrington had been escalating her authority. None of it individually was a deal breaker. Together it told a story. The 2 billion wasn't the problem, Ethan said, looking at the printout. The problem is what the 2 billion would have done. We put that kind of capital into a structure like this. We're not investing in a company. We're funding a culture. Daniel leaned back. So what are we doing? We're going to wait for Monday. Ethan looked around the table. And I want to know everything about the people at Harrington Global who aren't named Harrington. The people in the middle, the employees with track records. The ones who stayed when it would have been easier to leave. He paused. Find me the people who are doing it right, a system that isn't. One of the analysts, young woman, barely 30, had been with the firm for 2 years and still had the specific alertness of someone who was constantly recording everything for future use. Looked up. Are we looking for an exit strategy or a restructuring play? Ethan considered. We're looking for what the company would look like without the problem. She made a note. Outside the conference room, through the glass wall, the regular morning rhythm of the office continued. People moving between desks, conversations happening at normal volume. The functional hum of a place where the culture, as a matter of daily practice, matched what the leadership said it was. Ethan had built it that way deliberately. He had built it that way because of his father. Robert Walker had worked at Meridian Manufacturing for 26 years. He had operated a press machine on the floor of a plant in Ohio that made components for agricultural equipment, and he had done it with the specific undemonstrative competence of a man who understood that the work itself was dignity and that no job title owned a human being's value. Ethan had grown up watching his father come home from those shifts, had watched what it cost a man to give himself completely to a place that treated him as interchangeable, had watched his father absorb that reality without bitterness, not because he didn't feel it, but because he had decided, somewhere along the way, that bitterness was a tax on your own life, and he wasn't going to pay it. What he had said to Ethan, the summer before Ethan left for college, said it in the driveway of their house, leaning against a car that was 14 years old and ran on attention, and hope was this: when you build things, and you will build things, I know, you will don't forget what it costs a person to show up for something that doesn't see them. You build things that see people, that's all, that's the whole job. Ethan had built things. He had tried to remember. On the mornings when he forgot, he thought about his father's hands on the steering wheel of that 14-year-old car, and he remembered again. At 10:45, his phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't immediately recognize. He opened it. It read, "This is Sophia Bennett from last night. I'm sorry to contact you directly. I got your number from an operations contact at Walker Capital. I realized that was probably presumptuous. I wanted to say something, and I didn't know another way." He looked at the message. He typed back, "What did you want to say?" The response came quickly, like she had the words ready. "That Marcus, the staff member I was helping when you spoke to me last night, he came to me this morning to ask if his job was safe because of what happened. He thinks the video that's going around is going to get him fired because it happened near him. He's 19, he's been working events for 3 months. He's good at it, and he cares about it, and he's terrified." A pause. "Then I told him he was fine, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't lying to him." Ethan read the message twice. He typed back, "You weren't lying to him." Another message, "Thank you. That's all I needed." He started to put the phone down. Then he picked it up again. "Sophia, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Last night, when things went wrong with that tray, you didn't react the way most people in your position would have. You protected the staff member before you managed the optics." Why? The response took longer this time. He could almost feel her deciding how honest to be. "Finally, my first real event job, I dropped an entire tray of desserts at a corporate dinner. 120 people watching. My manager at the time spent the next 20 minutes explaining to those 120 people what an incompetent employee looked like. In detail. A pause. I never worked for that company again. And I swore I'd never make someone feel that way if I was in charge." Ethan set the phone down. He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at Daniel across the conference table and said, "I need you to find out everything you can about Sophia Bennett's professional background." Quietly, and with complete respect for her privacy. Daniel looked at him. "She's not a target," Ethan said. "She's a candidate." "For what?" Ethan looked at the printout of Harrington Global's governance structure. "For what comes next," he said. "Whatever that turns out to be." The weekend passed, the way weekends passed when Ethan was waiting for something significant. Lily had a soccer game on Saturday morning that ended in a draw she declared unsatisfying and a post-game team ice cream that she declared entirely satisfying. And they spent Saturday afternoon reorganizing her bookshelf by a system of her own devising that he did not fully understand but helped with anyway. Because helping with things you don't fully understand is one of the primary functions of being a parent. Sunday they drove to Ohio, to the house where Ethan had grown up, which his father still lived in. Robert Walker, now 74, retired from Meridian Manufacturing 6 years ago, with a pension that was adequate and a garden that was extraordinary and a calm that Ethan had been trying to achieve his entire adult life and had perhaps reached 40% of so far. They sat on the back porch after dinner. Lily was inside watching something on her tablet. The evening was mild, and the garden was doing what October gardens do when they've been well kept, holding on to the last of themselves before the cold. Robert Walker held a cup of decaf in both hands and listened to his son describe Thursday night without interrupting. When Ethan finished, his father was quiet for a long time. "How did it feel?" Robert asked, "when she did it?" "Cold," Ethan said, "literally." Robert almost smiled. "And the other way?" Ethan looked at the garden. "Like I was watching something I'd seen before. Not to me specifically, but I've watched it happen in rooms like that for 20 years. Someone deciding that another person doesn't matter because they can't identify the currency, because they can't see the value." He paused. "It just had my face on it this time." "And how does it feel now?" Ethan thought about it honestly. "Sad," he said finally. "Not angry, sad. Because she's not stupid, James Harrington's daughter. She's built things. She's accomplished things. And somehow she got to a place where she thinks the most powerful thing she owns is the ability to make someone feel small." He shook his head. "That's a terrible place to end up, with all that capability." Robert nodded slowly. "What are you going to do about the company?" "I don't know yet. That's Monday. And the woman, the event coordinator, Sophia, you think she's something. I think she's the kind of person who remembers what it cost her to be treated badly and responds by refusing to do it to someone else. Yeah, I think that's something." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Your mother used to say that was the real test, not whether hard things happen to you. Whether you let hard things make you hard." Ethan looked at his father. Robert was looking at the garden. "She was right as usual," he said. Monday arrived the way Monday always, when you've spent a weekend preparing for it faster than you expected and right on time. Ethan arrived at Harrington Global Headquarters at 9 a.m. He came alone, no legal team, no security, no advance team. Just himself and a manila folder containing a single sheet of paper, which he did not open during the meeting and which he did not need to, because the meeting was not about documents. He was brought to a conference room on the 44th floor. James Harrington was already there, standing near the window, looking older than the last time Ethan had seen him in person, which had been at a charitable board meeting 2 years ago. Next to James, seated and very still, was Victoria Harrington. She stood when Ethan entered. He looked at her. She looked at him. She was in a dark blazer, no jewelry, hair back. She looked like a woman who had spent the weekend deciding who she was going to be in this room and had settled on something real rather than performed. Whether that decision would hold, Ethan did not yet know. "Thank you for coming," James said. "Of course." Ethan sat down. Not at the head of the table. Somewhere in the middle, the neutral position, the one that said he was not there to dominate the geometry of the room. Victoria sat back down. Silence for a moment. Then Victoria said, "I'm not going to explain Thursday night." Ethan looked at her. "All right. I mean, I can explain it. I can tell you what I was thinking, what I assumed, how I read the situation. But when I play it back now, none of that matters, because the explanation doesn't change what I did. And I think you've probably heard a lot of explanations in your life that didn't change what happened." Ethan was quiet. She met his eyes. "I poured wine on a man I'd decided didn't matter, in front of 400 people. And I did it because I was wrong about who he was. But more than that, and this is the part I've been sitting with, for 3 days I did it, because even if I had been right about who he was, it wouldn't have been acceptable." The room was very still. James Harrington, across the table, had the expression of a man watching something he'd hoped for and had not quite expected. Ethan said, "Who did you think I was? Someone who'd slipped into an event they weren't meant to be at. Someone who didn't belong. And if you'd been right?" She held his gaze. "Then I would have been wrong in a different way. But still wrong." Ethan not forgiving, just acknowledging. "Let me ask you something," he said. "Straight answer, no positioning." "All right. In the 4 years you've run this company, How often have you walked the floor? The actual floor. Not executive visits, not announced walkthroughs. Just been in the building, in the regular spaces, paying attention to how people treat each other. She was quiet. I don't need you to count, he said. I need you to know whether you know the answer. A longer silence. I don't know the answer, she said. Not precisely. That's the answer, Ethan said. That's the only answer you needed to give me. He opened the manila folder. He pushed the single sheet of paper across the table. Victoria and James looked at it. It was not a legal document. It was not a term sheet or a proposal or a revised contract. It was a list of names, 12 names with titles and departments. Those are your people, Ethan said. The ones my team identified over the weekend. The ones inside your company who have been doing it right, quietly, without recognition, in a system that doesn't always reward them for it. He let them look at the list. That's what Harrington Global could be. Those 12 people are the culture your company was supposed to have. James picked up the paper. He read the names slowly. His jaw tightened. I know 3 of these people personally, he said. You should know all 12, Ethan said. They've been there longer than most of your executive team. Victoria was still looking at the paper. Something in her face was doing something complicated, the specific complexity of a person who is receiving information about the place they thought they knew, and discovering the map was wrong. What are you proposing? She asked, quietly, genuinely. I'm not proposing anything yet, Ethan said. I came here today to understand whether there's something worth proposing. He looked at her directly. I'm still deciding. He picked up the folder. He stood. I'm going to ask you to do something before we speak again, he said to Victoria. Not a report, not a presentation. I want you to have a real conversation with every person on that list. Not as the CEO asking for information. As someone who understands they've been doing the work while the room wasn't watching. He paused. And then I want you to tell me what you learned. He looked at James. Your company has real value, James. The bones are good. Your father built something that wanted to mean something. The question is whether the people running it now are willing to find out what it actually costs to mean something. He extended his hand. James took it, held it for a moment longer than a standard handshake. Your father would have liked you anyway, James said. I want you to know that. Ethan looked at him. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. He walked out. In the elevator down, he looked at his reflection in the brushed steel doors. He thought, this isn't over, he thought, but it's started. And then the elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened, and he walked out into the ordinary noise of a Monday morning in Midtown Manhattan, and he got out his phone and called Mrs. Callahan to confirm pickup for Lily at 3, and then he called Daniel to begin the process of what came next. Behind him, on the 44th floor of Harrington Global Headquarters, Victoria Harrington was still sitting at the conference table. The list of 12 names was in her hands. She was reading it again. She would read it 6 more times before she finally set it down, and when she did, she reached for her phone and called her assistant. I need to schedule 12 meetings, she said, starting today. Claire, on the other end of the line, paused. With which executives? Not executives. Victoria looked at the list. Get me the names on this paper. Another pause. Miss Harrington, some of these are floor-level staff. I know, Victoria said. Set the meeting. She hung up. She sat alone in the conference room on the 44th floor. And for the first time, in longer than she could clearly remember, she sat with the specific discomfort of a person who has looked at themselves accurately and found the picture different than expected. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was, she would later understand, the first step towards something real. But that understanding was still ahead of her. Right now, she just sat with the list and started, for the first time in a long time, to actually pay attention. The 12 meetings Victoria scheduled took 4 days to complete. She had expected them to be difficult in the way that difficult professional conversations were usually difficult, the careful positioning, the diplomatic non-answers, the performance of candor that people in organizations learn to substitute for actual candor when they don't trust the person asking. What she had not expected was the silence, not hostile silence. Not the silence of people protecting themselves. The silence of people who had been waiting so long for someone to ask the real question that when it finally arrived, they needed a moment to make sure they weren't misreading the situation. The first meeting was on Tuesday at 9 a.m. His name was Gerald Okafor, and he had been Harrington Global's head of floor operations at the Chicago manufacturing facility for 14 years. He was 57 years old. He had worked under 4 different regional managers, had been passed over for promotion twice, and had received, 3 years ago, a company-wide employee satisfaction award that came with a certificate and a gift card and no raise. He sat across from Victoria in the conference room she used for external client meetings. She had deliberately not used her office, because her office had a particular gravitational field she didn't want operating in this conversation, and he looked at her with the specific patience of a man who had learned not to invest too much in moments that resembled opportunity but historically had not been. She said, "I want to understand what it's like to run your facility." He said, "Which answer do you want?" She looked at him. "I want the one you'd give if nothing I did with it could hurt you." He was quiet for a moment, deciding. She could see it, the calculation running behind his eyes, the old math of self-preservation versus the rare pull of genuine invitation. "The work is good," he said finally. "The people on my floor are good. I've got 43 employees who have been there more than a decade, and those are 43 people who chose to stay when they didn't have to. That's not nothing." He paused. "What's harder is the feeling that the people making decisions about the facility have never spent more than 2 hours inside it." Victoria didn't say anything. "The last time a senior executive visited the Chicago floor," Gerald continued, "was 14 months ago. The regional VP came through. He was there for 40 minutes. He asked me one question." He stopped. "What did he ask?" "He asked where the bathroom was." The room was so quiet Victoria could hear the ventilation system. "That's the whole story," Gerald said. 14 years. 43 long-term employees. One question about a bathroom. He looked at her steadily. "I'm not angry about it. I passed angry about 5 years ago. But you asked what it's like, and that's what it's like." Victoria looked down at the list in front of her. Gerald Okafor's name. One of 12. "What would you change," she said, "if someone actually listened?" He leaned forward slightly, and for the next 40 minutes he talked. She wrote down everything. The second meeting was Wednesday morning. A woman named Patricia Chen, 44, head of HR compliance for the Northeast region, who had submitted 3 separate internal memos over the past 2 years flagging concerns about management conduct protocols, none of which had received a formal response. The third was a logistics coordinator in the Dallas office named Steve Brandt, who had developed an employee feedback system on his own time, piloted it with his team, demonstrated a measurable improvement in retention rates, and submitted it to his regional director 8 months ago, and never heard back. By the end of the 4th day, Victoria Harrington had filled 2 legal pads. She had not taken notes like this since business school. The deliberate, focused note-taking of someone who understands that what they are hearing contains more value than anything they already know. On Thursday evening, she sat alone in her office after everyone else had gone home, and she read back through both pads from the beginning. What she had built, she realized, was not a picture of 12 exceptional employees. She had built a picture of what her company had been failing to be for years, drawn by the people who had been living inside that failure and continuing to show up anyway. She called Ethan's direct line at 7:43 p.m. He answered on the second ring. "I finished the meetings," she said. "How did they go?" She looked at the 2 legal pads on her desk. "Gerald Okafor runs the best manufacturing floor in our entire operation. He's been doing it for 14 years. The last meaningful conversation he had with someone at my level was never." A pause. "Patricia Chen submitted 3 memos warning us about the exact kind of management behavior that ended up in those 2 NDA settlements. We paid to silence the outcome and ignored the person who predicted it." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite steady. "Steve Brandt built a retention system that works. We have a $41 million consulting contract with an external firm for a retention system that doesn't work as well. I found that out on Wednesday afternoon." Silence on Ethan's end. "I'm not telling you this to perform self-awareness," Victoria said. "I know that's probably what it sounds like. I'm telling you because I sat in a room with 12 people this week who have been right about things that matter for years, and the company I run didn't know their names." Her voice dropped slightly. "I didn't know their names." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do about it?" he asked. "I don't know all of it yet, but I know the first thing." She paused. "Gerald Okafor should have been a VP 3 years ago. I'm correcting that next week. Patricia Chen's memos are going to form the basis of a governance review I'm commissioning immediately, and she's going to lead it. And Steve Brandt's retention system is getting piloted company-wide while we terminate the consulting contract." Ethan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Why are you calling me?" She understood the question. He wasn't asking for information. He was asking her to say the real thing. "Because I'm not done," she said. "And I don't trust myself to be the only judge of whether I'm doing this right. I've been the only judge of what I was doing for 4 years, and look at where that got us." A pause. "I'm asking you for not oversight. I don't think that's the right word. I'm asking for someone who will tell me when I'm missing something." Another silence. "Sophia Bennett," Ethan said. Victoria blinked. "What about her?" "She called me on Friday. She was worried about a 19-year-old staff member who was afraid his job was at risk because of what happened at the gala. She tracked down my direct number to make sure she wasn't inadvertently lying to a kid about his employment security." A pause. "She didn't ask me for anything for herself. She asked for someone who had no power in her organization and nothing to give her." "I remember her," Victoria said slowly, "from the gala. She was the coordinator who moved first when she stopped. When I poured the wine, she moved first because that's who she is. Not because someone told her to." Ethan paused. "You asked me for someone who will tell you when you're missing something. I think you need someone inside the company who is already constitutionally incapable of telling you what you want to hear instead of what's true." Victoria was quiet. "You want me to bring her in," she said. "I want you to consider it. What you do is your decision." "What capacity?" "That depends on how serious you are about what you told me tonight." She looked at the 2 legal pads, at Gerald Okafor's name at the top of the first page, at Patricia Chen's 3 memos that nobody had answered, at Steve Brandt's retention system that worked better than $41 million of consulting. "I'm serious," she said. "Then you'll know what capacity," Ethan said. He ended the call. Victoria sat alone in her office for 20 minutes after that. Then she picked up the phone and called her head of talent. "I need you to find the contract for the event coordinator from the Sterling Gala last Thursday. Her name is Sophia Bennett. Get me her direct information." A pause. "Is there a problem with the event, Miss Harrington?" "No, there's an opportunity." She paused. "And I don't want to miss it twice." The talent director called back in 12 minutes with Sophia's contact information. Victoria did not have her assistant make the call. She dialed herself at 8:15 on a Thursday evening because she was beginning to understand that the way you reached out to people was information about how seriously you intended to treat them. Sophia answered warily, the careful voice of someone receiving an unexpected call from an unfamiliar number. "This is Victoria Harrington," Victoria said. The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. Victoria counted them. "Miss Harrington," Sophia said finally. Her voice was controlled, professional. The voice of a woman who had spent years managing situations that required her to stay composed while internally recalibrating at speed. "I know this is unusual," Victoria said. "I want to be direct with you." "All right. What happened at the gala last Thursday? I owe you an apology." "Not a company apology. A personal one. The way things went that evening, the environment that created you were managing your team through something that shouldn't have been happening in the first place. And I was the reason it was happening." Another careful silence. "Thank you," Sophia said. "I also want to ask if you'd be willing to meet with me. Not to discuss the event or Thursday night. I want to talk about a professional opportunity." The longest silence yet. "What kind of opportunity?" Sophia asked. "The kind that doesn't exist as a formal position yet," Victoria said. "Which is part of why I want to talk about it in person." A pause. Victoria could hear Sophia thinking, could hear the particular quality of a thoughtful person evaluating whether what they were being told was real or whether it was the very sophisticated version of being managed by someone with significantly more resources than they had. "How did you get my contact information?" Sophia asked. "From your event contract with the Sterling. Does the Sterling know you called me?" "No." Another pause. "Why not?" "Because this isn't about the Sterling," Victoria said. "This is about something I'm trying to build. And I think you understand something about building things that my company needs to understand better." The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of someone who had just heard something that hit close enough to true that it required a different kind of response than the ones they had prepared. "Friday afternoon," Sophia said finally, 11 o'clock. "I choose the location." Victoria didn't hesitate, of course. "And Miss Harrington?" "Yes. If this is about image management for what happened at the gala, I'm not the right person for it. I'll tell you that straight because I think you'll find out anyway." Victoria looked at the 2 legal pads still open on her desk. That's exactly why I called you, she said. The meeting happened at a coffee shop in Midtown that Sophia chose for reasons that were, Ethan would later think when he heard about it, exactly right, not so informal as to seem unserious, not so formal as to give Victoria the home field advantage of a conference room. Neutral territory, Sophia's call. Victoria arrived first and waited. That was also, Sophia would note, different from what she expected. When Sophia sat down, Victoria pushed an envelope across the table before either of them ordered coffee. Sophia looked at it. What is this? Open it. Inside was a letter. One page handwritten, which was itself a thing Victoria had not done in years. It was an apology, not the calculated, legally reviewed kind. The real kind, specific, without qualification, taking complete ownership. Sophia read it once. Read it again. She set it down carefully on the table. This doesn't change what happened, she said. I know that. People got hurt Thursday night. Not just Mr. Walker. My staff. She looked directly at Victoria. Marcus, the kid on my team, who was already terrified he had nightmares about that night. He's 19. He shouldn't be having nightmares about a business event. Victoria held Sophia's gaze. What would make it right for him? Sophia blinked. It was not the response she had anticipated. That's not. She stopped. I'm not asking rhetorically. I'm asking because you know him and I don't, and whatever the answer is, I want to try to do it. Sophia was quiet for a moment, visibly recalibrating. He wants to stay in events, she said. He loves the work. But he's convinced now that any mistake, any single thing going wrong means he's done. That fear is going to follow him. Victoria pulled out her phone. Made a note. I'll personally connect him with our corporate events team and arrange a mentorship placement with one of our senior coordinators. Paid, formal, with a recommendation letter from me at the end. She looked up. Not because it fixes Thursday, because it's the right next thing. Sophia looked at her for a long time. Why are you doing this? She asked. It was the question beneath all the other questions. The one that meant, I need to understand your motivation before I decide whether to trust the action. Victoria set down her phone. Because a man I'd never met showed up to an event I was hosting, and I treated him like he was invisible, and then I treated him worse than that. And then I found out it wasn't even actually about who he was in any financial sense. She paused. Because the real lesson wasn't that he controlled $2 billion. The real lesson was that it would have been wrong regardless. And I've spent 4 years running a company while somehow managing to miss that. Sophia was quiet. I'm not saying I'm fixed, Victoria continued. I'm saying I'm trying to understand what needs to be fixed. And from what I've seen and what I've been told, you understand something about that better than most people I have access to. She looked at Sophia directly. I want to create a role. Head of Employee Experience and Culture. Real authority, real budget, real access to leadership decisions. The mandate is to build the kind of organization where what happened Thursday night is structurally impossible. Not because we train people to hide it, but because we build something that doesn't produce it. The coffee shop moved around them. Other conversations, other mornings, people with their ordinary Fridays. That's not a real title that exists yet at Harrington Global, Sophia said. No, Victoria agreed. Which means I'd be building it from scratch. Yes, inside a culture that has actively resisted this kind of change for at least 4 years. Yes, Sophia looked at her. Why would I do that? Because you already do it for free, Victoria said. Every event you run, you do it for free. For the people on your team who don't have anyone else doing it for them. You do it because you couldn't watch someone get humiliated and not move first. She paused. Imagine having the resources to do it at scale. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Then Sophia picked up her coffee cup, wrapped both hands around it. I need to talk to someone before I give you an answer, she said. Of course. Take whatever time you need, it won't be long. She looked up. There's one condition that isn't negotiable. Tell me. I report directly to the CEO, not to HR, not to a VP of operations, not through 3 layers of management that can soften what I say before it reaches the person who needs to hear it. If I'm doing this, you hear everything I find directly. Victoria nodded once. Done, Sophia called Ethan that afternoon. He picked up immediately. She offered me a job, Sophia said. I know, a pause. You knew she was going to offer me a job? I suggested she consider you, another pause. Longer. Why? Because she needs someone who can't be managed, he said. And you've already proven you're that person. She was quiet for a moment. What do you think I should do? I think you already know what you want to do. That's not an answer, I know. A pause, Sophia. What did you do the night things went wrong with that tray? Before you knew who anyone was? Before any of this, she thought about it. I moved. Right. You moved because it was the right direction. Not because you had a guarantee about where you'd end up. He let that sit. Same decision. She made it. The announcement went out internally the following Monday, the same Monday that Ethan returned to Harrington Global for a second meeting, this time with Daniel and two other members of his team, this time with documents on the table. The announcement named Sophia Bennett as the company's first Chief Culture and Employee Experience Officer, reporting directly to the CEO. It also announced the promotion of Gerald Okafor to Vice President of Manufacturing Operations. And it announced that Patricia Chen would lead a comprehensive governance review, beginning immediately. By 11 a.m., Ethan had received a text from James Harrington. It said simply, "She's doing it." Ethan read the message in the conference room while Daniel walked through the revised investment framework on the other side of the table. He thought about his father's words. He thought about Margaret's voice in the mirror. He thought about Lily at the school entrance asking, "Are you going to fix it?" He thought about the difference between fixing something and rebuilding it. "Ethan," Daniel said. He looked up. Daniel had a document open on the table. The revised Harrington Global Investment Proposal. Modified, restructured, contingent on governance benchmarks and quarterly culture assessments, and a new board oversight structure that gave Walker Capital a formal advisory role. "We ready to discuss terms?" Daniel asked. Ethan looked at the document. He thought about Gerald Okafor, 43 long-term employees, and one question about a bathroom. He thought about Patricia Chen's 3 unanswered memos. He thought about Steve Brandt's retention system that worked better than $41 million. He thought about Sophia Bennett catching a tray of champagne glasses in a ballroom, then turning to a terrified 19-year-old and saying, "You're okay. Take a breath." "Yeah," he said, "we're ready." But here is what nobody in that conference room knew yet. Somewhere in the Harrington Global building, on a floor Ethan had never visited, in a department that didn't appear anywhere on the org chart he had reviewed, something else was happening. Something that had been set in motion, quietly, by people who had watched Thursday night's video, with very different feelings than most. Not inspiration, fear, because there were people inside Harrington Global who had benefited directly from the culture that Victoria was now dismantling. People who had built careers on the assumption that the hierarchy would always protect them. People who understood with sudden and terrible clarity that if Gerald Okafor was now a VP and Patricia Chen was leading a governance review, then the governance review was going to find things with their names on them. And 3 of those people had a meeting scheduled for Tuesday morning. Not with Victoria, not with Sophia, with each other. Ethan didn't know about that meeting yet, but he would. Because the thing about rebuilding something from the inside is that the parts that don't want to be replaced don't always go quietly. And Tuesday was coming. That Monday evening, Ethan was home before 5. He made dinner pasta, Lily's choice, which it always was when it was her turn to choose, because she had decided at age 6 that pasta was the perfect food and had seen no compelling evidence to revise that position. They ate at the kitchen table, the 2 of them, and she told him about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend that week over something he didn't fully follow, involving the rules of a game he'd never played. And he listened with the complete attention he gave her, the same attention he gave board meetings, given, freely given, without reservation. After dinner, she said, "Is the deal fixed?" He looked at her. "Parts of it," he said. "Which parts?" "The people parts," he said. "The money parts come next." She considered this with the gravity of someone who understood, at least in outline, what it meant. "Is it going to be okay?" He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. This girl who had her mother's way of asking questions that went exactly to the center of the thing. This girl who had inherited his father's stillness and her mother's precision, and had somehow made those 2 things into something entirely her own. "Yeah," he said, "I think it's going to be okay." She nodded. Picked up her fork. "Good." She went back to her pasta. He watched her for a moment, this quiet, extraordinary 9-year-old person, eating pasta at a kitchen table in Westchester County, completely unaware that her father had just redrawn the internal architecture of a 90-year-old company, and he thought, this is why it matters. Not the $2 billion, not the org charts or the governance reviews or the advisory roles or the carefully restructured deal terms. This, the fact that somewhere right now, a 19-year-old named Marcus was going to get a mentorship placement with a recommendation letter instead of a lifetime of fear. The fact that Gerald Okafor was going to walk into a VP office on Thursday and know, for the first time in 14 years, that someone had been paying attention. The fact that 3 memos Patricia Chen had written in the small, stubborn hope that someone would eventually read them were about to become the foundation of the most significant internal review in Harrington Global's history. This was why it mattered, not the power, the people. Ethan picked up his fork. Across the table, Lily was already onto a story about a documentary she'd watched about deep-sea creatures, which was apparently the most interesting thing that had ever been filmed, and he let her take him into it completely. This ordinary, extraordinary evening, this kitchen, this life he'd built around the things that mattered. And he was present, entirely, completely present, in the way that only people who have learned the hard way what presence is worth can manage to be. Outside, the October night was doing what October nights do. And in offices across the city, the forces that didn't want to be changed were beginning, very quietly, to organize. But that was tomorrow. Tonight was this. The Tuesday meeting that Ethan didn't know about, yet happened at 7:45 in the morning, before most of Harrington Global staff had arrived. In a private dining room at a restaurant, 2 blocks from headquarters, that one of the 3 men used regularly enough that the staff knew not to seat anyone nearby without being asked. Their names were Richard Calloway, Senior VP of Corporate Strategy, Warren Holt, Director of Executive Compensation, and Douglas Fenn, General Counsel. Harrington Global, the same Douglas Fenn whose signature appeared on both NDA settlements that Patricia Chen's memos had flagged. The same Douglas Fenn who had reviewed those memos when they arrived and made the decision, each time, that they did not require escalation. They ordered coffee. They did not order food. This was not a breakfast meeting. This was a meeting about survival. Richard spoke first, because Richard always spoke first. He was 63 years old and had spent 22 of those years building a career architecture inside Harrington Global that depended, in ways he had never needed to examine directly until now, on the assumption that the people at the top would continue to make decisions that protected the people just below them. "She's going to find everything," he said. Warren set down his coffee cup. "We don't know that. Patricia Chen has 3 memos. 2 of them name departments. One of them is specific enough that it names a process." Richard looked at Douglas. "Your process." Douglas Fenn was 61 and had the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades in rooms where things were decided and had learned to hold his face neutral regardless of what those things were. "The settlements were legal," he said. "The settlements were legal," Richard agreed. "The conduct that created the need for them wasn't." A silence. Warren said carefully, "What are we proposing here?" Richard wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I'm proposing that we get ahead of this. Before Chen's review turns into something that has subpoena power." "It's an internal review," Douglas said. "It doesn't have subpoena power." "Not yet," Richard looked at him steadily. "Walker Capital has a formal advisory role now. That's not internal anymore. The moment Walker Capital's legal team decides the governance review reveals material information that affects their investment decision, this stops being an internal review and becomes a due diligence investigation with entirely different teeth." The table was quiet. It was Warren, who finally said the thing none of them had said yet. "Are you saying we should approach Victoria?" "I'm saying we should approach Victoria before someone else approaches her with what we know," Richard said. "The difference between a voluntary disclosure and a discovered one is the difference between managing this and losing everything." Douglas stared at his coffee. "If we go to Victoria, we're handing her the weapons. If we don't go to Victoria, someone hands her the weapons anyway. At least this way we control the narrative." Richard's voice was flat and specific, the voice of a man who had spent 22 years controlling narratives and understood the mechanics of it precisely. "We go in, we acknowledge the issues. We frame them as systemic problems we were embedded in rather than individual misconduct, and we propose our cooperation with the review in exchange for a managed transition." "Managed transition," Warren repeated. "Resignations on our terms. References. Timing we negotiate." Richard looked around the table. "The alternative is Chen finds everything. Walker's lawyers get involved. And we're looking at the kind of exit that follows people for the rest of their careers." Douglas Fenn picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. He had reviewed those memos in real time. He had read Patricia Chen's specific, careful language. He had understood exactly what she was describing, and he had categorized it as a risk to be managed rather than a wrong to be corrected. He had been right that it was a risk. He had been wrong about which direction the risk ran. "Tuesday afternoon," he said finally. "We ask for a meeting with Victoria. All three of us. What do we say we're coming in about?" Warren asked. Douglas looked at him with the expression of a man who has just made a decision and is already living in the aftermath of it. "We say we have information relevant to the governance review, and we want to share it directly." They left the restaurant separately, 3 minutes apart. At 9:15 a.m., Sophia Bennett walked into her new office at Harrington Global for the first time. It was a corner office on the 38th floor that had previously belonged to a VP of communications who had left the company 6 months ago, and whose departure had not been replaced because the position had been, in the quiet vocabulary of corporate restructuring, absorbed. The office had a view Sophia didn't look at. She was already at the desk, laptop open, legal pad beside it, reviewing the agenda she had built for her first 2 weeks. She had been in the building for 11 minutes when Victoria appeared in the doorway. "How's the office?" Victoria asked. "Fine." Sophia looked up. "You have a problem." Victoria walked in, sat down in the chair across the desk, the guest chair. In Sophia's office, the CEO in the guest chair, without any apparent awareness that this was unusual. "What kind of problem?" "I had 3 separate people reach out to me yesterday. All 3 reached out through indirect channels. None of them used company email. All 3 said they had concerns about the governance review." Sophia looked at her. 2 of them said they were concerned because they think the review will be used to settle personal scores by leadership. One of them said he was concerned because he thinks the review is going to stop before it reaches the floors that actually need it. Victoria was quiet. "The second group is right to be concerned," Sophia continued. "The first group is trying to slow this down because they're scared of what gets found." "Do you know who's in each group?" "Not with certainty. But I know enough about how organizations work to know that the people claiming personal score settling are almost always the people who have things to protect." She looked directly at Victoria. "You're going to get pressure to limit the scope of the review. Probably soon. How you respond to that pressure is going to determine whether anything actually changes or whether this becomes a very expensive performance of change." Victoria looked at her for a long moment. "Sophia, you've been in this building for 11 minutes, I know. And you're already telling me something I'm not going to want to hear." "Yes." A pause. "Good," Victoria said. At 10:40 that morning, Richard Calloway's assistant called Victoria's assistant and requested a meeting for Tuesday afternoon. The stated reason was, exactly as Douglas had suggested, information relevant to the governance review. Victoria received the message during a budget call. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Sophia's direct line with one sentence. "This is what you were telling me about." Sophia replied in 40 seconds. "Yes, meet with them. I want to be in the room." Victoria started to type back a response. Stopped, deleted it, started again. "Is that standard?" she finally sent. Sophia's response: "Nothing about this situation is standard." That's the point. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. At 1:45, Ethan received a call from Daniel. "Something's happening at Harrington," Daniel said. "Our contacts in their legal department flagged a meeting request this morning. 3 senior executives asking for a direct meeting with the CEO. Off calendar." "Which 3?" Daniel named them. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's Calloway, Holt, and Fenn," he said. "You know them?" "I know their roles. Fenn signed the NDA settlements. Calloway was managing director of the division that created the conditions for the first one." Ethan stood from his desk, moved to the window. "They know the review is coming for them. What do you want us to do?" "Nothing yet." Ethan watched the street below, let it run. "This is Victoria's call. If they get ahead of it with a managed narrative, then we see whether Victoria knows the difference between a managed narrative and actual accountability." A pause. "That's the real test, not what she does with my input. What she does when she's under pressure and I'm not in the room." He ended the call. At 2 p.m. precisely, Richard Calloway, Warren Holt, and Douglas Fenn walked into Victoria's conference room. Sophia was already there, seated to Victoria's right, legal pad open, pen in hand. She did not introduce herself. She did not need to. Victoria had sent all 3 men a brief email an hour before the meeting, noting that Sophia Bennett, Chief Culture and Employee Experience Officer, would be present. All 3 men had Googled Sophia Bennett in the 45 minutes between receiving that email and walking into the room. What they found was her professional history, the events career, the Cornell degree, the Sterling Gala, and the 47-second video that had circulated the previous week, in which she was the person who moved first across the ballroom and reached Ethan Walker before anyone else did. Richard sat down and looked at Sophia with the specific appraisal of a man trying to rapidly recalculate a situation. She looked back at him with the specific patience of a woman who had spent years managing rooms full of people who underestimated her and had stopped finding it surprising. Victoria said, "You said you had information for the governance review." Richard nodded. He had prepared for this. He had run the script in his head a dozen times since Tuesday morning. He had the language ready, the careful framing, the systemic contextualization, the positioning of individual failures as institutional failures that he and his colleagues had been embedded in rather than architects of. He opened his mouth, and Douglas Fenn, seated to his left, said, "I reviewed Patricia Chen's memos." Richard stopped. Fenn looked at Victoria, all three of them. "The first one came in April, 2 years ago. I read it within 48 hours of submission. I understood what she was describing, and I made a decision not to escalate it." The room was completely still. "I want to be clear about that," Fenn continued. And his voice was doing something that none of the three men had prepared for. It was doing the specific thing that voices do when a person has spent a long time carrying something and has decided, in the last 12 hours, to put it down. "I'm not here to frame this as a systemic problem I was embedded in. I made individual choices, 3 separate times, and each time I chose the option that was easier for the company's legal exposure and worse for the people the memos were trying to protect." Richard was staring at Douglas Fenn with an expression that could only be described as a man watching his entire strategy dissolve in real time. Warren Holt was looking at the table. Victoria Harrington had not moved. Sophia had stopped writing on her legal pad. Her pen was still. She was listening with the complete attention of someone who understands that what they are hearing is the kind of moment that doesn't come twice. "I'm not going to ask for a managed transition," Fenn said to Victoria. "I'm going to submit my resignation today. But before I do, I want to give the governance review everything. Every file, every communication, every decision chain." He paused. "Not because I expect it to change what I did. Because the people who submitted those memos deserve to be heard, and the least I can do now is make sure the information exists in a form that can actually help them." The silence stretched. Victoria said, "Why are you doing this now?" Douglas Fenn looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "Because I watched a 47-second video last Thursday night of a man standing still while someone poured wine on him. And the thing that stayed with me, the thing I couldn't stop thinking about, wasn't what she did. It was what he didn't do." He looked up. He didn't defend himself by explaining who he was. He didn't say, "Do you know what I'm worth?" He didn't use his position to protect himself. A pause. He just looked at her and made one call, and the call wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Another pause. "I've been in this company for 19 years, and I don't think I've made a single decision in those 19 years that was purely about accountability. It was always about position. Always about exposure management." He shook his head slowly. "I'm 61 years old. I don't want that to be the whole story." Richard Calloway was looking at Douglas Fenn like he had never met him before. Warren Holt was looking at the table. Victoria looked at Sophia. Sophia held her gaze and gave a single very small nod. The nod that meant, "This is real." The nod that meant, "This is the thing you were hoping for, and didn't quite believe would actually happen." Victoria looked back at Douglas Fenn. "The review gets everything," she said. "All of it. And I'll take your resignation, Douglas. But I want you to know something first." She paused. "What you just did in this room took more than what most people manage in a full career. I'm not saying it fixes anything, but it matters." Fenn nodded once. He looked like a man who had just set down something very heavy and was still figuring out how to walk without it. Richard Calloway said, Richard." Victoria looked at him. "You should talk to your personal attorney before you say anything else in this room." He stopped. Something in her voice made it clear, without aggression, without theater, that the scripted version of this meeting was no longer operational. He nodded. He and Warren left together. Douglas Fenn remained for another 40 minutes. He spent that time with Sophia, going through the structure of the documentation he had access to, mapping the information architecture of everything the review would need to function effectively. When he left, Sophia sat alone in the conference room for 2 minutes. Then she called Ethan. "It happened," she said. "Tell me." She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Fen," he said, "I didn't see that coming, neither did I." "How is Victoria steady?" Sophia said, "actually steady. Not performed steady." A pause. "She's changing, Ethan. I know that sounds like something you'd want to believe rather than something you can observe. But I'm in the building. I'm watching it happen in real time. It's not complete, it's not clean, but it's real." He exhaled slowly. "How are you?" he asked. The question caught her slightly off guard. She was quiet for a moment, taking inventory. "Tired," she said honestly, "and more interested in coming to work tomorrow than I've been in years." He almost smiled. She could hear it. "That's the job," he said. The governance review, now supplied with Fen's complete files, expanded in scope within 72 hours. Patricia Chen, who received the news that her memos had been the foundation of Fen's decision to come forward, with the specific stillness of a woman who had spent 2 years being ignored and was still recalibrating to being heard, worked 16-hour days for the following 2 weeks, building a documentation structure that was thorough enough to withstand legal scrutiny and clear enough to be understood by people who were not lawyers. On the Thursday of the second week, she called Sophia. "I need to tell you something before it goes into the formal report," Patricia said. "Tell me. The 2 NDA settlements. The employees who signed them, I've been in contact with both of them. Through a legal channel that allows for it under the new disclosure framework." A pause. "They want to be part of the review. They want their experiences to be on the record." "Not the NDA record, the actual record." Sophia closed her eyes briefly. "Does Victoria know yet?" "No, I wanted to come to you first." "Why?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Because you're the person in this building I'm most sure will handle it correctly." Sophia felt that land, felt what it weighed. "I'll tell Victoria today," she said. "And Patricia, what you've built with this review. The documentation, the structure, the framework. This is going to matter for longer than this company." A pause. "I know," Patricia said quietly. "That's why I built it like it needed to last." Sophia told Victoria at 4:15 p.m. Victoria received it without flinching. She asked 2 questions about the legal parameters of the expanded disclosure and about the timeline, and then she said, "What do they need from us?" "They need to know the process is safe," Sophia said. "That there are no more Douglas Fens between them and the outcome." Victoria nodded. "Then we make it safe." She paused. "Sophia, I want to bring this to Ethan. Not because I need his permission. Because he was right about more things than I was comfortable with. And he deserves to know what's happening." Ethan received the update at 7 p.m. on a Thursday evening. He was in Lily's room, sitting on the edge of her bed, reading the last 3 pages of a chapter from a book they'd been working through together for the past 2 months, a habit they'd started. The year after Margaret died, when neither of them could quite fill the evenings, and they'd discovered that reading aloud to each other covered the specific frequency of the silence they were both trying to navigate. His phone buzzed. He read Victoria's message. He read it again. Lily looked up from the book. "Dad, sorry." He set the phone face down on his knee. "Sorry, where were we?" She found the line. He read. After, when she was settled and he was back in the hallway with the lights down, he picked up the phone and typed a response to Victoria. He typed, "This is exactly what right looks like. Stay the course." He sent it. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he walked downstairs and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house and thought about Gerald Okafor, who had started in his VP office 3 days ago and who had called Sophia on his first afternoon to ask just to make sure whether the promotion was real, because he wanted to be certain before he told his wife. He thought about Patricia Chen's 3 memos, now forming the architecture of a review that was being watched by people at 3 other major corporations who had learned, through their own legal networks, that something significant was happening at Harrington Global. Something that might set a precedent for what internal accountability could actually look like when it was taken seriously. He thought about Marcus, the 19-year-old, who was now 3 weeks into a mentorship placement with Harrington Global's corporate events team, and who had sent Sophia a message at the end of his second week that said, "I think this might actually be what I want to do with my life." He thought about a factory worker in Ohio who had leaned against a 14-year-old car in a driveway and told his son, "Build things that see people. That's the whole job." At 9:15 p.m. his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Richard Calloway. He stared at the name for 2 rings. "3, he answered. "Mr. Walker." Richard's voice had lost the executive architecture it usually carried. It sounded like what it was, a man in his 60s at the end of a week that had dismantled 22 years of certainty. I know I don't have any standing to call you. You called, Ethan said. So say what you called to say. A pause. I was in the room on Tuesday. When Douglas said what he said, I heard about it. Then you know I came in with a different plan. His voice was careful, honest in the way that only becomes possible after the performed version has stopped working. I was going to frame it as systemic. I was going to give them just enough to look cooperative without giving them anything that mattered. I know, Ethan said. A pause. When Douglas started talking, I sat there for 20 minutes feeling like someone had pulled the floor out. His voice shifted. I've been in that company for 22 years, Mr. Walker. I have told myself for 22 years that the things I went along with were institutional realities, that they weren't my choices in any direct sense, that they were just the way things worked. A pause. And then Douglas Finn, who I have known for 19 years, who I thought I knew, sat there and refused the script. And I realized I had been waiting for someone else to do that for 22 years. The kitchen was quiet. Ethan said, "Why are you calling me?" "Because I need to know if there's a version of what comes next where I'm actually useful." Richard's voice was stripped of everything except the question. Not protected, not managed, just useful to the thing that's being built. "Because I know where the bodies are buried, Mr. Walker. I know how it worked and who it worked for and what it cost. And I can either be someone the review has to dig past or someone who helps it dig." A pause. I'm asking which one I should be. Ethan was quiet. He looked at the kitchen table. He thought about his father's hands. He thought about a 47-second video. He thought about the specific difference between a man who had too late and a man who had decided too late but had still decided. "Call Sophia Bennett tomorrow morning," he said. "Tell her what you told me. Everything, not a curated version. Everything." He paused. "What happens after that is between you and the process." "That's all?" "That's everything," Ethan said. "It's harder than it sounds." He ended the call. He sat in the kitchen for a while longer. The house was completely quiet now, Lily asleep upstairs. The October night doing its October things. He thought about something Daniel had said in passing during the first restructuring meeting, something so ordinary that Ethan had nearly let it go by. "You know, most people would have just walked away from Harrington Global entirely. Taken the $2 billion somewhere simpler." And Ethan had thought then, as he thought now, simpler isn't always the point. Because the simpler choice, the clean exit, the frozen investment, the story that ends with a righteous withdrawal, that choice would have been about him. About his dignity, his position, his signal to the market about what Walker Capital stood for. This choice was about Gerald Okafor walking into a VP office. About Patricia Chen's memos finally getting read by someone with the power to act on them. About a 19-year-old named Marcus who was beginning to understand that one bad night at a gala didn't have to define the shape of what came after. About a company 90 years old that had been built by people who had believed it meant something and had been slowly hollowed out by people who had forgotten what meaning required. That was worth the complicated choice. That was worth every phone call and every meeting and every moment of sitting in a hallway outside a 9-year-old's bedroom reading messages on a phone while the house was quiet and wondering if what he was doing was enough. It wasn't everything, but it was the direction. And direction, Ethan Walker had learned from his father, from his wife, from 11 years of building something real from the inside out. Direction was how you got anywhere worth going. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. And while he slept, on the 38th floor of the Harrington Global building, in the corner office that had been empty for 6 months and was now full of 2 legal pads and a purpose that hadn't existed 3 weeks ago, the light was still on. Sophia Bennett was still at her desk, still working. Because that was who she was, and that more than any deal term, more than any org chart restructuring, more than any carefully worded press release, was how you actually changed something. You found the people who were already doing it right, and you gave them room. Richard Calloway called Sophia at 8:15 the next morning. She was already at her desk when the phone rang, which meant she had been there long enough to have finished 1 cup of coffee and started a second, which meant she had been there since before 7, which was something she would not have admitted to because she did not want it to become an expectation, but which was simply what happened when the work felt like the right work. She answered on the first ring. Richard said, "I spoke to Ethan Walker last night." She had not known he was going to call. She had not been warned. She took that information in, adjusted her understanding of the situation by about 30 degrees, and said, "I know who you are, Mr. Calloway, I assumed. Tell me why you're calling." He told her. All of it. Not the curated version he had prepared for Tuesday's meeting. The actual version, 22 years of choices made under the assumption that institutional loyalty and personal protection were the same thing, and the specific moment in a conference room when he had watched Douglas Fenn refuse that assumption and had felt the architecture of his own justifications collapse in real time. He talked for 23 minutes without her interrupting. When he finished, she said, "What do you want from this call?" "I want to give the review everything I have, not through a lawyer." Directly. "Why not through a lawyer?" "Because a lawyer will tell me what I can afford to give you. And I'm trying to give you what the review actually needs." He paused. "Those are different quantities." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Calloway, and I need you to hear it plainly. All right, what you give this review can help real people. The employees who were on the other end of the decisions you're describing, some of them, are still in this building. Some of them left. Some of them left because of decisions you participated in." Her voice was even, not punishing, just accurate. "Whatever happens to your career after this, the thing that matters is what the information does for them. If you can hold on to that, when it gets uncomfortable, and it will get uncomfortable, then come in. Today, 2 o'clock, a pause, I'll be there," he said. He was. He arrived 11 minutes early, which Sophia noted because early arrivals told you something about a person's state of mind. He sat in the conference room without his lawyer, without a prepared statement, with only a single thumb drive that he set on the table in front of him, and did not touch for the first 20 minutes while he talked. What was on the thumb drive was 22 years of institutional memory, internal communications, decision chains, approval records, the specific paper trails of every moment when a problem had been categorized as a risk to be managed rather than a wrong to be corrected. It was the organizational history of a culture that had learned, at some point between founding and now, to prioritize the protection of its own hierarchy over the dignity of the people inside it. Patricia Chen joined the meeting at 2:45. She sat across from Richard Calloway, and she did not say anything for the first 3 minutes. She just looked at him, not with anger, exactly, with the specific clear-eyed regard of a woman who had submitted 3 memos and received 3 silences and was now sitting across from one of the people who had decided those silences. Richard met her eyes. He did not look away. Finally, Patricia said the first memo. "April 2 years ago. Did you read it?" "Yes." "What did you think when you read it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was accurate. And then I thought about what it would cost to act on it." "Which was?" "Disruption," he said, "to relationships that had taken years to build. To a chain of decisions that would have to be examined. To people whose cooperation I needed for things I believed were important." He paused. "I told myself the cost was too high, and now?" Richard looked at Patricia Chen, this woman who had written carefully and specifically about real harm 3 times and been categorized as a disruption risk, and he said, "Now I think the cost of not acting was paid by people who had no say in the calculation." Patricia looked at him for another long moment. Then she opened her legal pad. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the beginning." He told her. The review expanded again. By the end of the 3rd week, Patricia's team had processed more documentation than any internal governance review in Harrington Global's history. More than the 2 regulatory inquiries from the 90s. More than the SEC review in 2008. More than anything the company had ever voluntarily opened to examination. Word got out, the way word always gets out in corporate environments, not through announcements but through the specific frequency of behavior change, that people who work in organizations learn to read the way Saislers read weather. Something was different. Something was being taken seriously, in a way that things had not been taken seriously before. People who had been waiting, in the quiet, resigned way of people who have stopped expecting change, began to do a different kind of waiting. On a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th week, Gerald Okafor called Sophia from Chicago. "Something happened on the floor today," he said. "I want you to know about it." "Tell me." "One of my senior operators, woman named Denise. Been here 12 years, she came to me this morning. She had a complaint, not about me, about a process that has been in place since before I got there that has been making her job harder for 12 years, that she had submitted twice through the old system and heard nothing back." Gerald's voice carried something in it, the specific weight of a man who understands what it costs a person to try a 3rd time after twice not being heard. "She came to me because she heard about the review. She heard that things were being taken seriously now. She came to me because she decided to try one more time. Sophia closed her eyes briefly. What did you do? I sat down with her for an hour. We went through the process together. I found 3 other operators who had the same problem. I've already put a formal request through to operations to review the protocol. He paused. Sophia, she cried when I told her we were going to look at it. Denise, 12 years on this floor. She cried because someone was going to look at it. The line was quiet for a moment. That's why we're doing this, Sophia said. That's exactly it, I know, Gerald said. I just wanted someone to know it's working. Out here, on the actual floor, it's working, she told Ethan that evening. He was in his car, sitting in the school parking lot, waiting for 3 o'clock pickup. He had blocked his calendar every day from 2:45 to 4 and had told Daniel that the block was non-negotiable, which Daniel had accepted without comment because Daniel understood which things were negotiable with Ethan and which were not. He listened to what Gerald had said about Denise. He was quiet for a moment. 12 years, he said. 12 years, Sophia confirmed. He watched the school entrance through the windshield. How's Victoria? Working harder than I've seen anyone work. Not performing it, actually doing it, a pause. She walked the Chicago floor last week. Unannounced. She was there for 4 hours. Ethan thought about a 40-minute visit and one question about a bathroom. Gerald know she was coming? Nobody knew she was coming. That was the point. Sophia paused. She had dinner with 6 of his floor operators afterward. At a diner 2 blocks from the facility, she paid. She listened for 3 hours. He exhaled slowly. That's not nothing, he said. No, Sophia said. It's not. The school doors opened and the afternoon release began, the daily controlled chaos of children reclaiming themselves from the structured world of learning, and Ethan watched for Lily's braids in the crowd. Sophia, he said. Yeah, you did this. I want you to know that. Not me, not the deal, not the $2 billion. You're the thing that made this real. A pause. Gerald did this, she said. Patricia did this. Denise did this, Denise, who came back a 3rd time after twice getting nothing. Her voice was steady. We all did this. He saw Lily, the asymmetrical braids. The backpack too big for her frame, same as every day. The 9-year-old walk that was somehow both tentative and completely certain. I have to go, he said. Go, she said. He got out of the car. Lily saw him, and her face did the thing it did, not a big reaction, not a child's theatrical delight, but the quiet, specific settling of a person who has been holding something uncertain and can now let it go. You're on time, she said. I'm always on time. You're not always on time. I'm almost always on time. She fell into step beside him toward the car. How was your day, he said. Actually good. She glanced up at him, checking. The radar still operational. Something happened. A lot of things happened. Good things? He thought about Denise crying in Gerald Okafor's office after 12 years. He thought about Patricia Chen's 3 memos finally doing the work they were written to do. He thought about Douglas Fenn, who had put down something heavy, and Richard Calloway, who was still learning how to walk without what he'd been carrying. Yeah, he said. Good things. The formal closing of the restructured Harrington Global investment happened on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the gala. Not in a ballroom, not with 400 guests and a string quartet and a backdrop reading the next century. In a conference room at Walker Capitol, with a table of 8 people and coffee from the machine in the break room that was, by general consensus, not very good, but had the advantage of being honest about what it was. Ethan signed last. He set down the pen and looked around the table. Daniel, the Walker Capital board members. Victoria, across from him, who had come alone, no legal team flanking her, no executive bodyguard of advisors. James Harrington, 79 years older than the company he had built, sitting at the end of the table with his hands folded, and something in his face that was not quite pride and not quite relief but lived in the territory between them. And Sophia, whom Ethan had specifically requested be present, because the investment structure included a formal governance component that she would be administering, and because she had earned the right to be in the room where it closed. She was seated to Victoria's right, the same position she had taken in the conference room on the day of the Tuesday meeting. Ethan had noticed that and said nothing about it, but he had noticed. Victoria looked across the table at Ethan. I want to say something, she said. Before we leave this room. Everyone was quiet. I have spent 6 weeks trying to understand what happened at the Grand Sterling. Not the event, the condition, the thing that made that event possible. She looked at Ethan steadily. I've come to the conclusion that it didn't start the night of the gala. It started years before in small decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and accumulated into something I would not have recognized as mine if I'd seen it from the outside. She paused. Gerald Okafor has been running the best manufacturing floor in our operation for 14 years. I didn't know his name until 5 weeks ago. That's not a management failure. That's a values failure. And values failures don't come from one bad night. They come from thousands of ordinary days in which the wrong things were treated as acceptable. The room was very still. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm fixed, she continued. I'm going to tell you that I understand, for the first time in a way that is operational rather than conceptual, that the work of this is not the governance review or the restructured investment or the new org chart. The work of this is every day. She looked at Sophia. I have someone who will tell me when I'm getting it wrong. I intend to actually listen. She looked back at Ethan. That's all I have to say. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. That's enough, he said. They shook hands. Not the long hold that James had given him at their second meeting. A clean, equal handshake. Two people on the same side of something. The deal was done. In the weeks that followed, the story continued to move in ways that none of them had fully anticipated when it began. The governance review, now complete, became something Patricia Chen had quietly begun to understand it might become during those 16-hour days in her third week, a document. Not a legal document, a framework, a specific, reproducible architecture for what internal accountability could look like when it was built from the evidence of what had actually failed, rather than from the wishful theory of what should have worked. She published it, with Victoria's full support, and Ethan's, through a nonprofit governance institute that had been asking for exactly this kind of material for years. She published it under her own name because Ethan had told her it should have her name on it. She had pushed back on that for 2 weeks. He had waited her out. Her name was on it. It was downloaded 47,000 times in the first month. Legal departments, HR teams, board governance committees, business school professors building case studies, junior employees at companies they were beginning to understand weren't quite what they had hoped, all of them downloading Patricia Chen's framework, all of them carrying forward something that had started with 3 memos sent into silence. She called Ethan when the download count crossed 50,000. I don't know how to feel about this number, she said. How do you feel? A pause. Like I want to call the version of me from 2 years ago and tell her it wasn't for nothing. It wasn't for nothing, he said. I know that now. Douglas Fenn, true to what he had said in the conference room, spent the months after his resignation in a different kind of work. He joined the board of a legal ethics organization that had been trying for years to build a framework for corporate counsel, the specific question of what a general counsel owed to the people inside a company versus to the executive structure above them. He brought 19 years of institutional knowledge to that question and no remaining investments in the answer being comfortable. He called Ethan once, 4 months after resigning. He said, I want you to know that I don't regret it. Ethan said, the resignation or the Tuesday meeting? Either, Douglas said both. A pause. I wish it had happened 20 years earlier. But I've stopped giving myself the luxury of that version of the regret. The one I can actually do something about is the one that starts from Tuesday. That's right, Ethan said. Your father sounds like he was something, Douglas said. Ethan paused. Did someone tell you about my father? Victoria mentioned it. What he told you about building things that see people. A pause. I've been thinking about it since she told me. I didn't have a father who said things like that to me. I think that's part of the story. He was quiet for a moment. It's not an excuse, but it's part of it. Most of it is part of something, Ethan said. The question is what you do with the part that's yours to carry. I know, Douglas said. I'm figuring that out. Marcus, the 19-year-old, who had nearly dropped a tray of champagne glasses on the night that changed everything, completed his mentorship placement in December. His final evaluation from the senior Harrington events coordinator, who had worked with him, called him one of the most instinctively professional young event managers she had encountered in 15 years of corporate events work. He called Sophia when he read it. She picked up immediately the way she always did. He said, I wanted to tell you before anyone else. She said, I'm so glad you called, he said. Miss Bennett, can I ask you something? Of course. The night at the Sterling, when everything went wrong with the tray. You said to me, take a breath, you're fine. You didn't know if I was fine. You didn't know how it was going to go. Why did you say it? She thought about it for a moment. Because you needed to hear it more than I needed to be accurate, she said. And because I believed it was more likely to be true if I said it. A pause. That's really good, he said. It's something someone else did for me once, she said. I'm just passing it along. The thing about a story like this one, the thing that makes it more than a lesson and closer to something true, is that it doesn't end cleanly. Real change doesn't end cleanly. It continues and complicates and finds new forms, and sometimes it moves backward before it moves forward again. And the people inside it have to keep choosing the same direction, on the days when it's hard, and on the days when it's harder, and on the days when the progress is invisible, and all you have is the commitment you made when the progress was clear. 1 year after the Grand Sterling Gala, Ethan Walker returned to that ballroom. He had been asked by Sophia, who had organized the event, which was Harrington Global's first annual Culture and Leadership Forum, a day-long gathering that had replaced, permanently, the gala format that had defined the company's public events for 20 years. There was no stage backdrop with silver letters. There were no tiered tables that sorted guests by importance. There was no hierarchy in the room arrangement at all. Executives and floor-level employees and mid-level managers and new hires sat wherever they chose to sit, at round tables that were deliberately, specifically equal. Gerald Okafor was there. He sat next to a Harrington Global board member, and they talked for 20 minutes about a manufacturing process, innovation Gerald had been developing, and the board member took notes. Patricia Chen was there. She gave a 30-minute presentation on the governance framework to a room that included the CEOs of 3 other companies who had flown in specifically to hear it, because their boards had required them to attend after reading the published version. Marcus was there. He was running the event logistics. He was wearing the specific expression of someone who has found the work they're meant to do and woken up to it. Douglas Finn was not there. He had not been invited, and he had not expected to be, and when Sophia had called him a week before the forum to tell him about it, and to tell him she thought what he had done mattered, he had said, "That's generous of you." And she had said, "It's accurate," and that had been enough. Richard Calloway was there. He had stayed at the company, through the restructuring, in a reduced role that he had accepted without negotiation, because the alternative he had been offered was resignation, and he had chosen this, instead chosen to be useful in the place he had helped to damage, which was a harder choice than leaving, and the one he believed he owed. He sat in the back of the room during Patricia's presentation, and did not look like a man who had spent 22 years managing narratives. He looked like a man learning to listen. Victoria stood at the front of the room in the morning, before anything else, and she said, 12 months ago, I made a choice in this room that I have to live with. I'm not going to describe it again because the description isn't the point. The point is what we do with what it taught us. And what it taught me is that a company is not its org chart, or its balance sheet, or its press releases. A company is the sum of how its people treat each other on ordinary days when nobody powerful is watching. She paused. I intend to be someone who watches, differently than I did. And I intend to be someone worth watching for the right reasons. She stepped back from the microphone. The room did not erupt. It didn't perform. It applauded in the way that rooms do when something real has just been said. And the people in the room recognize realness because they are tired of the alternative. Sophia found Ethan in the mid-morning break, standing near the same support column where she had first spoken to him a year ago. She stood next to him, and they both looked at the room. Funny, she said. Standing here, I was thinking the same thing. She looked at the room. Gerald at a round table with a board member, still talking. Patricia answering a question from one of the visiting CEOs. Marcus moving efficiently through the space, with the specific ease of someone who has stopped being afraid of it. The worst night created all of this, she said. No, Ethan said. The worst night revealed what was already there. Patricia had already written the memos. Gerald had already built the team. You had already been doing the work. He looked at the room. The worst night just stopped the machinery long enough for anyone to see it. She was quiet for a moment. Your father was right, she said. About building things that see people. He usually was. Does he know? What happened here? I took Lily to see him last month. Told him the whole story. Ethan almost smiled. He listened the way he always listens. At the end he said good, just that good. He paused. Then he went back to his garden. He had tomatoes he was worried about. Sophia laughed. A real laugh. The easy kind. The kind that happens when something is genuinely funny rather than performed for the comfort of the room. That's perfect, she said. That's him, he said. They stood there for another moment in the room that had been the site of something ugly, and was now, 1 year later, the site of something else not perfect, not finished, not a clean ending, because clean endings were for stories that didn't require the people inside them to keep choosing, keep working, keep showing up on the ordinary days when the significance was invisible and all you had was the direction you'd committed to. His phone buzzed. A text from Lily. "How's the big event?" He looked at it, felt the familiar pull, the invisible thread that ran from wherever he was back to wherever she was, always operational, never quite silent. He typed back, "Good. Actually good." Her response came immediately, the way 9-year-old responses do when the phone has been in hand waiting. "Did you remember to eat breakfast?" He laughed. "Yes," he typed. He had not. "You didn't," she sent back. He put the phone in his pocket. Sophia was looking at him, with the expression of someone who has just been shown something true about a person. "She knows you," Sophia said. "She knows me better than anyone," he said. And then, after a moment, she has her mother's radar. The room around them continued the conversations and the connections and the specific, difficult, necessary work of people, trying to do better than they had done before. And Ethan Walker stood where he had stood a year ago, in the same ballroom, wearing the same kind of suit, holding a glass. This time it was coffee. This time nobody looked at him like he didn't belong. This time everyone in the room knew exactly who he was. Not because of the $2 billion, not because of the Frozen deal, or the viral video, or the headlines that had run for 2 weeks after the gala, but because of what he had chosen to do with the morning after. Because of the 12 names on a piece of paper. Because of the meetings he had taken, and the questions he had asked, and the patience he had kept, when it would have been so much easier to take the simpler road and call the whole thing a loss. Because of a man in Ohio who had once said, "Build things that see people." Because of a woman he still loved who had asked him to remember. Because of a 9-year-old girl with asymmetrical braids who had looked at him across a kitchen table and asked, "Are you going to fix it?" He had not fixed it. He had done something harder and more important than fixing it. He had helped the people who were already inside it find enough room to fix it themselves. And that the quiet, difficult, necessary, unglamorous work of making room for people who were already doing the right thing was the whole job. It had always been the whole job. His father had known that from a factory floor in Ohio. His wife had known it from the first day she watched him build something and asked him to remember what it was for. And Ethan Walker, standing in a ballroom that had once been thus of the most humiliating moment of his public life, drinking bad coffee with good company, watching people who had once been invisible to the people with power talk to each other as equals. Ethan Walker knew it too. He knew it all the way down, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.